The Peace Studies Institute of Spokane Community College presents authors Dr. Scott Finney and Professor Angela Davis Wisner in a dialogue, Unlocking the Master Narrative. Our third episode, Russia's War on Ukraine, Implications for the Future of Peace and Security in the International System. Our guest for today's panel is Dr. Heather Ashby. Dr. Ashby is the Senior Program Officer for the Center of Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She earned a bachelor's degree in history from George Washington University and a PhD in Russian and Global History from the University of Southern California. Dr. Ashby joined the USIP after 7 years with the Department of Homeland Security, where she worked at the intersection of Homeland Security and international affairs, specifically U.S. Russia relations. Her expertise includes Russia's activities in the Global South, with analysis and research on Russia's influence and use of force against other countries. Her commitment to humanitarian efforts in Ukraine is commendable, and we're honored to have her here with us today.
It is really my pleasure and honor to be able to provide the welcome this morning from Spokane Community College for SCC's Peace Studies podcast, the Russia's War on Ukraine. This is an exciting event, I think, and we have a couple really distinguished guests here today on a very important topic. As part of our welcome, I want to make sure that I recognize some of our distinguished faculty who helped make this happen. In particular, Angela Smith of Communications Studies and Angela Wisner in the Communications Study Department as well. And a special recognition to Angela Wisner for her years and years of diligence and persistence to make SCC Peace Studies a viable entity at Spokane Community College. Without her work and dedication, we wouldn't be here today and we wouldn't have a Peace Studies Institute at our college. So I want to talk real briefly about why this is important to SCC, why we support, promote, and host these kinds of events at SCC. As an institution of higher education, it is our role and our mission to provide educations for learning, for building awareness, and to engage in civil discourse. And this topic of peace is one that, with our current topic today, shows us, one, how fragile peace is each and every day in our world. It tells us how damaging the decisions and actions of one person can be on global peace. And it also tells us that in the absence of peace, the air is only filled with unthinkable amounts of human tragedy. So because of that, the topic of peace today and the discussion we will have today is one that's very important for SCC and for those of us who are stakeholders at the college. So thank you.
Our guest for today's panel is Dr. Heather Ashby. Dr. Heather Ashby is the Senior Program Officer for the Center for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Dr. Ashby joined USIP after 7 years with the Department of Homeland Security, where she worked at the intersection of Homeland Security and international affairs, specifically U.S. Russia relations. Her expertise includes Russia's activities in the Global South, with analysis and research on Russia's influence and use of force against other countries. Her commitment to humanitarian efforts in Ukraine is commendable, and we are honored to have her with us today.
Well, Dr. Ashby, we're so happy to have you here as our special guest, and we have some interview questions for you. As the president mentioned, this is quite a time to have your voice and your research and your expertise. And when it comes to this issue of being a global community, all of a sudden this recent unfortunate event has definitely pressed that issue. So in light of that, first question, what is the historical motive for Russia's aggression and ultimate invasion that has resulted in outright war? What would you say?
All right, first, thank you so much for being here and the warm welcome introduction. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
And so, in thinking about the historical aspects of this conflict, it really goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And that came through in an essay that Putin wrote last summer that talked about the relationship from his viewpoint, which was completely distorted, between Russian and Ukrainians, and doing it from such a perspective that it justifies Russia's aggression, imperial control over Ukraine, over history, which is completely inaccurate. I don't know what history books he's using, but those were not accurate at all. The other aspect is grounded in Russian imperial history. from the Tsarist Empire into the Soviet Union, and this expansion that happened under the Tsarist Empire for territories that were near Russia. And then with the Soviet Union, with the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Union trying to reconstitute those lands, but at the same time trying to build up the national identities of these countries that they were trying to form. And so that national identity for many of those countries that became part of the Soviet Union by force was already in formation. And so what the Bolsheviks did was do their own interpretation of nationalism, but through their views of Marxism. And so that was another aspect that's come forward historically of Putin's justification for the level of aggression is going back to Soviet nationalities policy and saying that it was a fiction created. So since Lenin put together all of these countries by force, it was assuming that, Ukraine wasn't a real nation, not under the Tsarist Empire and then not under the Soviet Union because it was created by Lenin and it's a legacy of the Soviet Union. And so grounded in that is just throughout the Soviet period, all the level of aggression, murder, atrocities that the army committed against those various countries that were part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine being extremely prominent in terms of the famine that happened under Stalin, as well as the murder of thousands, tens of thousands of Polish elites during World War II. And so that level of aggression is just part of the system and logic that's been continuing on under Russian power that was in the Soviet Union and dominating the Soviet Union, and now under Putin.
Okay. Along that same line, does it make any sense, or is there any degree of rationale behind this thought that with Hitler's invasion, Napoleon's invasion, the need for buffer nations around, is there any sensibilities coming out of that historical background, or is it really kind of what you've said, really something they've worked up in their own nationalistic approach?
I think every nation has a right to act in their own national interest, but not in the sense of violating the territorial integrity and the right to self-determination for other countries, and that's what's happening here. So Russia can look out for its own security, but it also goes back, for me, just studying the early Soviet period, is this idea of, at the time, capitalist encirclement. And that language just continued to evolve, and now it's Western encirclement and fears of the West. And so that feeds into building up strong relations with China, even though part of Siberia was part of China until the early 20th century in a war that took place, or late 19th century. And so this idea of encirclement and under siege and need to always be on the defensive is part of that Russian government thinking that continues to permeate and finds ways of evolving and remaking itself over time. And so in terms of a buffer area, I think that's challenging because the people who are in those buffer areas have the right to determine who they align themselves to.
Sure.
And so what could happen is just having the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. It shouldn't be between the U.S. and Russia, Western European countries and Russia, because you shouldn't talk about Ukraine without Ukrainians there. It makes no sense. And so we should take the lead of Ukraine, and if they want to form their own security guarantees with other countries, they have the right to do that. It's not within Russia's powers to say you need to be a buffer zone for us, because we are insecure and we have our own issues in terms of our national interests. Russia needs to think creatively and engage in dialogue with countries it terms enemies or hostile to it. You shouldn't just say, this country against the will of its people needs to be our buffer and serve us. It makes no sense.
Sure, great, appreciate that, thank you. Yeah.
That's a beautiful summary, and no boundaries of nation states, for him at all. And that's what's so interesting. Let's build on that NATO question. How much of Russia's aggression is motivated by economic envy, and ties to the West rather than the military intimidation due to the encroachment of NATO?
I think it also has its grounding in history, because I'm a historian by training, so I always look back.
Yeah,
And not
that's
saying
great.
that history is something that's inherent to people, like Russia is always going to be aggressive for these reasons. It's historical in terms of how they think and how it evolves and how they respond to certain conflicts and crises. So in thinking about NATO, I know there's so much out there that NATO expansion helped trigger Russia's level of aggression
Yeah.
and the way they responded. And I would say that if you look at Russian history, empire, that it's more grounded in that than it is into just NATO expansion over a few decades. It's this mentality that you have the ability to dominate whoever you want and be this big country. And I think there are those challenges with Russia in terms of it sees itself as this superpower because it has nuclear weapons. Absent the nuclear weapons, they wouldn't necessarily be a superpower. And so they have this belief that they should be respected for that. And so they want people to come to them, build economic relationships, but there's no incentive for those other countries to partner with Russia because the advantages and what the needs of those countries and seeking economic relationships, it doesn't mesh well with Russia. And so there is
You
that
wrote
type
an
of
article
challenge.
on Russia's involvement in Africa. Touch upon that, what you just said. If we fulfill the needs of people outside of Russia, then they don't have to go to Russia. And you mentioned that in your article. Expand a little bit about that.
Yes, and so that goes into the challenges of U.S. foreign policy, that we have our own interests in the way we allocate funds through Department of Defense, USAID, Department of State. And so when countries come to us, instance in Africa, and say, these are our issues that we're dealing with, if you want to partner with us, these is where we want the funds to go. But then you have U.S. officials, senior officials say, well, that's not our vision of what we want to do to help you. And I think that's a challenge. So then you have people look for alternative sources of funding, but they're not going to meet it with Russia because they're, for different parts of Africa, they are dealing with terrorism and security issues of Boko Haram that spreads over multiple countries in Africa. And the Russians aren't going to help you with that. But on the other side, the U.S. doesn't want to give weapons and a lot of that military support to governments that aren't democratic. So how do you help address the governance challenges? But you have this immediate concern of security issues. And then it also gets into how are we supporting those countries right now who are very vulnerable to food security. And I haven't heard that much come out of the U.S. or looking at the large international institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, the UN, other than saying we have few food insecurity issues, but then no one's really coming up with solutions to address that.
Wrapping up the NATO question, what do you think about Sweden and Finland wanting in?
They have the right to do that, and I understand why.
What do you think Putin's thinking?
He is thinking that, or I think he believes that it's just another enemy. And so it goes into this whole idea of Western encirclement. And so now you're going to have more countries who consider a threat. Yeah, and it just feeds to it.
Yeah.
Without realizing, oh, you provoked them. You had a good relationship with the Finnish president previously. You could talk to him, have this dialogue, and now you blew that up. Yeah.
Blew it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
What do you got, Scott?
You know, based on this whole idea of ethnocentrism, Ukraine's ethnocentrism has blossomed. Of course, the articulation, the eloquence of President Zelensky, I think has surprised everyone. Although he was a reality TV actor before, so maybe he just switched it over, but he's been very inspiring. In light of that, what do you think? How has the nationalistic fervor for their nation state played a role in the undaunted courage and commitment to personally invest in their nation's defense, as we all can see worldwide now?
I think it's incredible. I think people forget how diverse Ukraine is. Because of its history, it was formerly under like the Polish Empire that extended in there, the Russian Empire, you have the movement of people, the Austrian Habsburg Empire. And so you have different religions, different ethnicities. And so what this war brought forward is now thinking strongly as Ukrainian among those linguistic differences, religious differences, different historical backgrounds, and that people are coming together in this fight for their nation, for their democracy, and the right to determine their own future. And so I think it's incredible. And so what we're learning from our partners in Ukraine is the way that ordinary Ukrainians, regardless of their background, regardless of their profession, are pitching in to help, especially with the internally displaced population. So we hear so much about refugees, but there are millions of Ukrainians who are moving east to west because of the violence from the southwest, where there aren't that many attacks taking place from the Russian army. And so that's also causing stress on the system. And so people are stepping up, providing assistance to those Ukrainians who are being displaced, as well as looking to provide trauma support. Because you're in a war, you need to address the trauma and people who are losing family members, parents who are losing children to this horrific war.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. Appreciate
It's
that.
awful.
Angela, what would you?
You know, this podcast includes communication theory. These students in here are from the intercultural communication class. What negotiation techniques, which is a big part of our instruction, would you employ if you had the opportunity?
I think right now negotiation is so difficult. And so in terms of the way the Russians and Ukrainians are speaking together, one thing to consider is what we have learned at U.S. Institute of Peace is that there is no mediator in the room. So you can't verify who's saying what. And so that's why during the last big negotiation, you had the Ukrainian side saying one thing and the Russians like, oh, they didn't listen to us, and had a different interpretation. And without having a mediator there, you can't verify what was accurately said and captured, because they're just going to go with their own impressions of it, particularly on the Russian side, to advance their own interests. So it could have been a situation that they reach some type of agreement on a topic, and then the Russian side goes to Putin, because you can't agree to anything about Putin personally in this situation because it's so level, agreeing to it. And he's like, I'm not going to do that. So then you have Lavrov come out and deny certain things that the Ukrainians said. And so by having a mediator in the room, you could help address some of those challenges. But it would be who would be the mediator in the room, and who would they agree to.
When there's absolutely no trust present at the table.
Yes.
Or goodwill.
Yeah, definitely. Especially if you look at the Russian negotiation team. It's insane who's leading the negotiation team. He's this ultra nationalist who believes in the power of Russian empire, Russian identity, Russian culture. You have that person leading your negotiations with the Ukrainians, so you're already sending a message before you even get to the table about who do you, what do you consider the Ukrainians? And so that's quite unfortunate. And so in terms of negotiation, I would say the first step is to have a mediator. There may be multiple mediators representing different countries who have relations with Russia and Ukraine to help mediate the discussions that are taking place. And then the other aspect is to start small, to have dialogue. And so it looked like there would be some dialogue in terms of exchange of prisoners. But now with the Ukrainian soldiers leaving that steelworks plant and the Russians just taking them back to Russian territory, that was extremely disheartening in terms of having that discussion, at least on the most basic level of exchange of soldiers. And so it also shows you how the Russians view their own soldiers who are captured by the Ukrainians, of just leaving them. And
Just
they're
leaving
not,
them. Yeah.
Amazing.
Oh, that's interesting. Your title for today was Peace and Security in the International System. What are the implications for that?
I think it's massive, and it doesn't come across so much in a lot of the coverage of the war, because there's a media term to see what's going on, to know who's winning what battle, where the forces are migrating, if it's in the south or eastern part of the country. And I think we're also victim to the U.S. need for like everything to happen quickly, and it's playing out like reality TV. And now we're on the next episode of the Russia's aggression. And so wars last a long time. And what's going to happen is it's just going to continue to play out over the course of the rest of this year, even though some speculated that Russia is going to lose the capacity by August, September. And
Do
so,
you think they'll think about using nuclear weapons if he gets desperate and he doesn't have?
I am not sure that he will, unless he feels personally threatened, not just that, oh, there's always the possibility that NATO will attack from his mindset, is that if there's going to be someone to stage a coup within Russia to take out Putin, because in Russia, you leave office, you either die or you find some way of getting out of a coup, like Khrushchev and Gorbachev. And so those are your options. You die or there's a coup. And if he feels that his personal life is threatened, it raises the possibility. But also, there's also some confusion in terms of if Putin gives the order, whether other people will agree to it, who at the end of the line will push the button. And so there's speculation that it won't, even if he makes that decision, that the person at the end of the line won't do it. And we have an example, excuse me, from the 1980s that my colleague brought up, early 1980s, in which the Russians got an alert that there was going to be an attack, and the person who was monitoring it and could have hit the button to help trigger, excuse me, the use of Soviet weapons was like, this seems off. Maybe it's a problem with our system. And so they were considering that before they're like, let me start the whole process of deploying nuclear weapons. And so I have faith that someone at that level is going to be like, I'm not part of this. Because you're also seeing discontent among the Russian elite in terms of all the sanctions, the views of Russia in the world. And so even though they are consolidating because of that nationalistic need to defend yourself against an outside force and view, there's still a discontent within those ranks. And so we'll see whether, after the order, whether anyone else wants to push the button and be responsible for that and go down in history for that action, as well as Shoigu, the defense minister, and Lavrov, or maybe another official who would participate in those discussions and be like, you may agree to Putin in the room, but afterwards you're like, I'm not doing this.
Well, that's somewhat comforting.
Something else behind the scenes. Before we turn over to the audience questions, when we talk about restrictive sanctions, how effective has this whole effort by the global community been, do you think, in restricting and making the Russian leadership, especially Putin, maybe reconsider his stance? What do you think?
I think what's challenging about sanctions is that it's only a group of countries that are committed to the sanctions, and most of those countries fall into what we define as the West. And the West is not just Western European countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, but also Japan and South Korea. And so to varying degrees, those countries have implemented sanctions, some of it in coordination, but then you see like Japan still wanting to do some level of liquefied natural gas with Russia and import Russian energy because they don't want to turn to the Middle East. And then you have India, which still wants to move forward with its defense cooperation with Russia and try to get around sanctions. And so a couple of years ago, there was a law passed called CAATSA. And so it gives out carve-outs for countries who want to cooperate with Russian or people who are sanctioned. And so then there's a waiver passed by the administration to not sanction that country for doing business with sanctioned countries and individuals. And so there have been carve-outs to sanctions through that law. And so what's not discussed is what have been the carve-out to the sanctions that the U.S., the Europeans, Japan, South Koreans have granted. And it's still unclear, but I think sanctions are being felt in the way Russian economy is taking place and the way they're responding. They're just kicking the can down the road. So eventually it's going to be felt full force by the Russian middle class, which, especially those in Moscow and St. Petersburg, that when there is unrest, really targeting that and not so much concern about the non-big cities in Russia, then you may see a greater reaction to return to negotiating table, not only with Ukraine, but trying to figure out what would Russia have to agree to in order to lift some of those sanctions?
Interesting, very interesting. What do you think, Angela?
That's
Shall we?
interesting. We go into the informal part of the
Yeah.
program where we just ask students to just talk and see if they want to ask you something. So it's open to the audience. Anybody like to ask a question?
Oh, we have a question over here.
I have a question.
Would you stand up and talk nice and loud?
I have a question involving Sweden and Finland joining NATO. I had heard on the BBC that we decided not to allow any military installations underground to respect Russia and to avoid acts of aggression. Would that be a framework for future NATO expansionism for other countries bordering Russia? Or maybe after Russia dissolves, it could maybe work for China, for other countries bordering China as a peaceful solution? I just want your opinions on that possibility as far as going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a good question in terms of even if they become part of NATO, whether they are going to allow installations, missiles, and exercises to take place right at their border with Russia, and that caused some issues for Russia, like UK exercises in the Black Sea with other partners. And so I think that's part of what Sweden and Finland and seeking to join NATO, but also not fully giving the finger to Russia and leaving the space open for dialogue. And that could serve as an example in terms of future NATO expansion or just the way NATO is operating now in terms of the Baltic countries and Poland, to say, hey, you can still participate in exercises, you're part of NATO, you have that Article 5 participation guarantee, but we're not going to put installations. And that was part of the conversations that were taking place before Russia invaded again, with the United States and with European partners about where those installations were going. And then they just decided, like, oh, the West won't respond strongly if we go in and invade again. Unfortunately, they made that decision instead of resorting to negotiation. And so after all of this loss of life, this brutality, it could end up coming back to that conversation that could have been had before the invasion happened.
That's always the case, isn't it?
And in regards to China, I'm not sure, China definitely is not supportive of NATO. And so I'm not sure in terms of the security dynamics with countries bordering China. I know they've had challenges in the past in terms of the way the U.S. has engaged in exercises with other countries near China and the China Sea. And so that's something to also monitor in terms of whether the U.S. is going to be bold with European partners as well as Australia, because Australia has its own tensions with China militarily that have been taking place, but it's been pretty quiet because of so much attention focused on Ukraine. How that's going to develop in terms of defense partnerships. Our relationship with Vietnam has improved not only diplomatically but militarily because of the concerns about China and Chinese expansion and the China Sea.
Wow, we learned a lot in that one,
Yeah,
didn't we?
that's a good one, yeah.
How about over here? Anybody? Questions? You smart students?
Oh, there's one in the back row there.
What does Ukraine's future look like after the war? What do you think? I think Ukraine is going to be stronger democratically. I think it's people remember that there was a lot of corruption in the government. And that's been one of the challenges in terms of its EU membership and this far off belief of joining NATO, even though they had that discussion about Ukraine someday joining NATO. Part of that was the challenge of the corruption within the society and meeting certain prerequisites. And so I think you're going to see improved governance structure. You're going to have the Europeans in the US and Western countries, including Japan and South Korea, contribute to the rebuilding of Ukraine, because it's so necessary in terms of what Ukraine contributes to the global economy, which no one really realized before this war. And stuff as basic as wheat and sunflower are so critical to the Middle East and African countries that I also see possibly Middle Eastern countries contributing to Ukraine's rebuilding because of that critical role they play in the food supply. And so governance, infrastructure, as well as being stronger democratically and greater integration into Western and European economies, maybe the greater movement of Ukrainians within the EU for jobs. But I think there will also be concerns about not doing a brain drain, excuse me, out of Ukraine and making sure all those bright people who are dealing with so much trauma right now return to Ukraine and help with the rebuilding. And I don't think that would be a significant challenge because so many of them will want to return to rebuild their country.
Excellent.
Good question. What do you say? We have time for one more question, and I want to get this in. We have so many Ukrainian and Russian students on our campus. What message can you send to them? A hopeful message as they suffer through this.
Yes, I would say that one, feelings of anger, particularly from Ukrainians, is valid, so we should never downplay that. But that the actions of Putin doesn't represent all of Russians, and finding small ways to engage in conversation, come together and show support. I know there is a lot about polls in Russia saying that Russians support this war, but people often forget that in an authoritarian society, it leaves little room for you to think independently.
Yeah.
And so when someone asks you a question of whether you support the government, of course you say yes. And so when those questions are asked, it's the propaganda that they're responding to, not the actual situation.
Right.
So we need to keep that in mind. And just the brutality that Russians are living under in Russia, aside from the impacts of sanctions, but this shutting down of civil society, civil space, independent discourse, independent media, ways of just people are able to voice their opinions without fears of being arrested or disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore in Russia. So having that type of empathy for Russians as well is important, but understanding that Ukrainians are entitled to their right to be angry right now and to look for ways to have conversations, to join together and to contribute to refugees or family members who may be in Ukraine, Russians who may have left because they don't want to be under that system.
Right.
And show their own resistance to Putin, to support those Russians as well who are building up that opposition to Putin and his whole system, because at some point Putin is not going to live forever. And so we need to also think eventually of how to support Russians to go back and build a better system.
Yeah.
Great.
That's beautiful.
Shall we try one more?
I think that's it. And then we have
We have our spotlight section.
Spotlight.
Let's see. At this point, we'd like to go to our spotlight segment. We like to point out some historical individual or setting that we feel puts the icing on the cake. And today we're going to talk about President Zelensky. And I think, Angela, you'll take
Just
that.
a little bit on President Zelensky. He is in our spotlight for this episode. Rabbi Seitner says, because he knows what he's willing to die for, he knows what he's willing to live for. I thought that was a nice summary for Zelensky. Let's take a closer look. Zelensky was born of Jewish ancestry, if you did not know that, in 1978 in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So he grew up in that, a region with a prolonged history of anti-Semitism. Widely popular actor and comedian, representing the everyday people in skits and roles that he played. They're very interesting if you get a chance to look at them. For the past 3 years, he's been the democratically elected president of Ukraine, an inspirational leader for over 44 million Ukrainians. And he's trying to fight Putin's war machine. With a dedicated army of 250,000, he strategically stands in defiance to the onslaught of a heavily armed Russian army of 3 million, really fighting against all odds. He stands alongside his Ukrainian neighbors as they have lost over 15,000 lives and displaced over 12 million people.
Wow. Amazing.
Think about that, the size of a couple of our states. As a result of his personal defiance and defense of his homeland, he is now an international symbol of courage to other free nation states across the globe. And I like to end with this quote. It's Zelensky's quote. Let's build a country of opportunities where everybody is equal before the law and where the rules of the game are honest, and transparent, and the same for everyone.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you, Dr. Ashby, for
Well,
joining us.
thank you so
Yeah.
much. I really appreciate this as well as the questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This has been something. And this, of course, is our third installment of our Voices Unmuted podcast brought to you by the SCC Peace Institute that we feel at this point of the juncture with you in conjunction with what you're doing in Washington, D.C., we hope this ends up to be a partnership that makes a difference in the world. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, President Brockman, for joining us as well. And we'll turn off at this point, but hopefully you can join us on our next segment series of the number 4 that we'll be joining into. Thank you.